"Step away before your son sees security remove you," Dr. Celeste Grant said, loud enough for the hospital atrium to hear. Malcolm Reed stood still as his 9-year-old son Isaiah clutched an orange paper boat beside approaching security officers. At 8:12, the CEO removed a stranger. By 5 p.m., her biggest deal would be dead. The cause was her buried report and the black single dad she never bothered to identify. Malcolm had arrived at St. Catherine Medical Center before sunrise because Isaiah's cardiology appointment had already been postponed twice. Rain darkened the shoulders of his inexpensive navy coat. A paper pharmacy bag sat inside his canvas backpack beside a red folder marked Pediatric Access Review. Isaiah walked close to him, careful not to crush the orange boat his mother had taught him to fold before she died. Malcolm had spent 6 years learning how to answer a child's questions without making promises medicine could not keep. That morning, he promised only breakfast after the appointment and that he would stay beside Isaiah for every test. The atrium was already busy when they entered. Nurses crossed the polished floor under a glass ceiling, families waited beneath digital signs, and executives gathered near a roped-off reception desk for a contract ceremony. A silver banner announced a 5-year partnership between St. Catherine and the MercyLine Community Purchasing Cooperative. Malcolm paused beneath it. His name was nowhere on the banner, by design. MercyLine's clinics trusted the work more than the face behind it, and Malcolm had learned that quiet ownership often protected negotiations from ego. He guided Isaiah toward pediatric registration, where a red warning flashed beside the boy's appointment. 6 years earlier, Malcolm had not owned a cooperative or advised a network of clinics. He had been a procurement analyst sleeping in a vinyl chair beside his wife Renee, while leukemia turned every hospital invoice into a new language he had to learn. Renee noticed that he read the fine print when frightened and told him that fear was useful only when it became attention. After she died, he raised Isaiah alone and built MercyLine one neighborhood clinic at a time. He never presented himself as a savior. He found waste, negotiated, shared prices, and made small practices strong enough to say no. Isaiah knew only parts of that history. He remembered his mother's laugh, the lavender scarf she wore in winter, and the paper boats she folded from old appointment notices. Malcolm kept the harder details away from him. He wanted the boy to understand grief without inheriting panic. On appointment mornings, Isaiah folded a fresh orange boat and wrote one brave thing inside before closing the paper. That day he had written, "I can ask the doctor a question." Malcolm had not seen the words, but he knew the ritual and guarded it as carefully as any contract. The clerk apologized. Someone in executive administration had reassigned 4 pediatric slots to accommodate a donor tour. Isaiah's test had been moved another 6 weeks, even though his medication authorization expired on Friday. Malcolm asked for the written access policy and placed his red folder on the counter. He did not raise his voice. He explained that a delayed cardiac stress test could interrupt the prescription, and he asked the clerk to call the patient access supervisor. Isaiah unfolded one corner of the paper boat, then pressed it flat again. That small movement told Malcolm more than the boy's brave smile did. The first postponement had happened because a scanner failed. Malcolm accepted it. The second came when a specialist was called into emergency surgery. He accepted that too. Medicine required triage, and families could not demand certainty from a living system. But this third delay was different. The equipment worked, the specialist was present, and the empty room had been reserved to impress donors walking past its window. Malcolm had spent his career separating unavoidable scarcity from choices disguised as scarcity. The red code on Isaiah's screen told him exactly which kind he was facing. Maya Chen, the registration clerk, had worked at St. Catherine for 11 years. She recognized the gold executive code and hated what it meant. Her own nephew's appointment had once been moved under the same label, but staff were trained to call it a maintenance adjustment. Maya had learned to survive by apologizing softly and never naming the pattern. When Malcolm asked for the policy instead of blaming her, she felt the shame of that survival more sharply. She opened the escalation screen, but an administrator locked the record remotely before she could submit it. Across the atrium, Celeste Grant noticed Malcolm only because the contract photographer asked him to move. She saw a damp coat, a canvas backpack, and a black father standing inside the executive lane. She did not see the founder, whose signature MercyLine still required. She strode over with her communications director behind her and asked whether he was delivering food. Malcolm said they were waiting for pediatric cardiology, and that the desk had displaced a medically urgent appointment for the ceremony. Celeste glanced at the growing audience and decided his quiet objection was a threat to her picture-perfect morning. "The donor entrance is not a complaint counter," she said. Malcolm pointed to the pediatric access sign directly above them. He asked her to read the reassignment note before dismissing the clerk. Celeste did not look at the screen. She told the clerk to close the record and ordered Malcolm to leave the desk. Isaiah stared at the floor while a photographer lowered his camera. Malcolm felt the familiar heat of public judgment, but he also felt his son's hand against his sleeve. He chose each word slowly because Isaiah was learning what dignity looked like under pressure. Malcolm explained that St. Catherine's own policy required same-day review when a delay threatened medication continuity. He opened the red folder to the highlighted clause. Celeste pushed the folder shut with 2 fingers. She said policies were not interpreted by people who walked in from the street. A few executives laughed because she had smiled when she said it. The clerk did not laugh. She had seen Malcolm's name on the MercyLine correspondence the night before, but Celeste had warned staff not to interrupt the ceremony with vendor questions. The clerk lowered her eyes and said nothing. The words struck Malcolm with an old familiarity. He had heard polished versions of them in bank lobbies, boardrooms, and supply warehouses. People like you do not understand the process. People like you should be grateful for access. People like you become a problem when you know the rule. He refused to let memory write his response. Renee used to tell him that anger could reveal a boundary but should never hold the pen. He placed one palm on the red folder and asked Celeste whether she was denying the policy, the medical risk, or his right to request review. Celeste answered none of those questions. She turned to the audience and said the hospital could not allow every dissatisfied visitor to interrupt executive business. The sentence converted a sick child into a nuisance and transformed her preference into institutional necessity. Malcolm saw several people accept the framing because it arrived from a tailored suit beneath a hospital logo. He also saw 3 people resist it: Maya at the keyboard, the older security officer near the entrance, and hospital counsel Evelyn Price beside the ceremony banner. None spoke yet, but each had begun paying attention. Isaiah asked whether they had done something wrong. Celeste answered before Malcolm could. She said grown-ups sometimes created scenes when they did not get special treatment. Malcolm knelt so his eyes were level with his son's. He said, "Asking someone to follow the same rule for every child is not asking for special treatment." Then he stood and asked Celeste for her name and title, though both were printed on the banner behind her. Her expression hardened. To her, the question sounded like a challenge from a man she had already placed beneath her authority. Celeste called security. She described Malcolm as disruptive, though his hands remained open and his voice never rose. The officers stopped several feet away because the older one recognized the difference between danger and embarrassment. Malcolm handed him the appointment notice and asked him to read the cancellation time. The officer saw that it had been changed at 6:03 that morning by an executive account. Celeste ordered him not to audit hospital scheduling in public. Around them, phones began to lift. A mother in the waiting area pulled her daughter closer and kept recording. Malcolm could have ended the humiliation with one sentence. He could have told Celeste that MercyLine represented 38 clinics, that its 5-year purchasing agreement was worth more than $18 million to St. Catherine, and that he held the deciding signature. Instead, he looked at Isaiah. His son was watching not only what power could do, but what a good man would do when he possessed power of his own. Malcolm put the red folder back in his bag and asked the officer for a written incident number. Power had taught Malcolm one lesson that authority rarely advertised. Revealing leverage too early could erase the evidence of how ordinary people were treated. If he announced his title, Celeste might restore Isaiah's appointment, shake his hand, and leave the gold code untouched for the next family. His silence was not a trap. It was a refusal to purchase fairness with status. He wanted the institution to meet the rule while believing he was exactly who Celeste thought he was. A father with no audience except his child. The younger officer shifted his weight as bystanders recorded. He had been trained to move disruptive visitors quickly, yet everything visible contradicted the word disruptive. Malcolm stood still. Isaiah whispered. Celeste issued commands faster each time someone hesitated. The officer glanced at his partner, who lowered one hand from his belt and asked dispatch to preserve the call audio. That small procedural choice later became one of the strongest pieces of evidence because it captured Celeste, describing the family as undesirable before either officer had assessed them. Celeste laughed at the request and said there would be no incident report if Malcolm left quietly. The older officer replied that dispatch had already created one when she called. That answer changed the clerk's face. A digital record now existed outside Celeste's presentation deck. The communications director whispered that the MercyLine delegation would arrive in 12 minutes. Celeste told him to move the ceremony upstairs and then told security to escort Malcolm through the service corridor, away from cameras. Her attempt to hide the scene made the recording look worse than the scene itself. The older officer refused to use the service corridor because Malcolm had broken no rule. He offered to walk father and son back to pediatric registration instead. Celeste stepped between them and canceled Isaiah's visit entirely, saying the family could return when they were prepared to cooperate. The clerk finally looked up. She said the child's authorization expired Friday. Celeste answered that consequences taught people how institutions worked. Isaiah's fingers crushed the bow of the orange paper boat. Malcolm heard the paper crack and knew the morning had crossed a line no apology could erase. He asked the clerk to print the cancellation. Celeste said nothing would be printed. Malcolm held out his phone and calmly read the policy clause into the time-stamped incident recording. Then he stated Isaiah's patient number, the time, the names of the people present, and the request being denied. He did not accuse anyone of bias. He created a clean, factual record. The hospital counsel standing near the ceremony banner turned toward him for the first time. She recognized the discipline of someone who understood compliance better than the executives surrounding him. At 8:26, Malcolm and Isaiah walked to the public seating area instead of leaving the building. Malcolm called Dr. Lena Ortiz, Isaiah's cardiologist, but reached voicemail. He sent the printed notice through the patient portal and requested an emergency medication bridge. Then he bought Isaiah hot chocolate from a kiosk and repaired the paper boat with a strip of clear tape. Isaiah asked why the CO had looked at them as if they did not belong. Malcolm said some people mistook a building they controlled for a world they owned. "We still tell the truth inside it," he said. While Isaiah sipped his drink, Malcolm opened the MercyLine due diligence dashboard. St. Catherine's proposal had strong prices, new imaging equipment, and a promise to reserve pediatric appointments for cooperative families. It also contained a certification signed by Celeste stating that executive events never displaced medically necessary care. The cancellation on Isaiah's portal contradicted that certification within minutes of the signing ceremony. Malcolm did not fail the proposal. He marked the contradiction for independent review, exactly as MercyLine's charter required when a founder had a personal conflict. That charter existed because Malcolm had once watched a wealthy clinic owner punish a supplier over a private insult. MercyLine's first members had feared they were replacing corporate power with one man's preferences. Malcolm agreed and wrote recusal rules stronger than anyone requested. A founder could flag evidence, but could not vote on a contract involving his immediate family. Every critical claim needed a record outside the founder's control. At the time, lawyers called the safeguards excessive. In the atrium, they protected Malcolm from becoming the very kind of executive Celeste accused him of being. The dashboard showed how much depended on the decision. Catherine would provide imaging, specialty referrals, and discounted medicines to clinics serving neighborhoods where patients already traveled too far for care. $18 million was not a prize sitting in Malcolm's pocket. It was 5 years of coordinated purchasing, thousands of appointments, and narrow margins that could keep clinic doors open. Rejecting the bid casually would hurt people he would never meet. Approving a false certification could hurt even more. The weight of both truths kept him measured. The first person to sit beside him was the registration clerk, Maya Chen. She had taken her break early and carried no folder. She apologized for freezing when Celeste closed the record. Malcolm did not ask her to become a hero. He asked one question: had other children been displaced for donor or executive events? Maya said the schedule carried a hidden gold code at least twice a month. Staff were told it meant equipment maintenance, but the rooms often stayed open for VIP families. She had screenshots on her phone and had never known where to send them safely. Malcolm told Maya to use the hospital's protected compliance channel, not his email. He explained that evidence belonged in a process no angry executive could call personal. Maya feared the complaint would return to Celeste. Malcolm showed her MercyLine's contract clause requiring an external reviewer for access complaints during procurement. He offered to pay less, not more. MercyLine would remove a costly public relations package from the proposed deal and use those funds for an independent patient advocate. It was the kind of answer no sales executive expected. Maya agreed to submit what she had. Maya returned to the desk and photographed nothing more. Malcolm had warned her not to gather records she was not authorized to access. Instead, She submitted the screenshots already on her phone, named the dates she remembered, and asked the reviewer to preserve the scheduling archive. Her restraint mattered. Celeste would later claim an employee had stolen data for Malcolm, but the access logs showed the external reviewer collected every additional record under the contract's own authority. The evidence grew without a single rule being bent on Malcolm's behalf. At the ceremony, clinic directors shifted in their seats as the promised founder failed to appear. Some knew Malcolm well by voice, but had never met him in person. He often attended negotiations remotely while caring for Isaiah and allowed Amina to represent the Cooperative publicly. Celeste had interpreted that absence as weakness. She believed MercyLine needed scent. Catherine's prestigious brand more than scent. Catherine needed the clinics. Her entire strategy rested on the assumption that people with fewer marble floors possessed fewer choices. Upstairs, Celeste began the ceremony without Malcolm. She told the assembled clinic directors that MercyLine's founder had been delayed and that operational details would be settled later. Her team displayed photographs of smiling children and promised equal access across every neighborhood. The hospital council asked why security had been called downstairs. Celeste described Malcolm as an aggressive visitor exploiting his child's appointment. The older officer's report had not yet reached her screen. She believed rank allowed her to define reality before documents could catch up. At 9:04, MercyLine's board chair, Amina Brooks, called Malcolm from the elevator. She had just heard Celeste announce that the founder was absent. Malcolm asked Amina not to confront anyone. He disclosed Isaiah's involvement and recused himself from the immediate vote. Amina listened to the incident number, the cancellation timestamp, and the certification page. Then she asked the question that mattered. Could the Cooperative verify the evidence without trusting Malcolm's account? He said yes. The patient portal, dispatch log, access code, and ceremony schedule all existed independently. Amina postponed the signing for 4 hours and announced a routine document review. Celeste treated the delay as a negotiation tactic. She offered to increase MercyLine's executive travel allowance and add a charitable photo opportunity with Isaiah. Amina asked why a child whose appointment had been canceled was suddenly valuable in a photograph. Celeste's smile disappeared. She demanded to speak to the founder privately. Amina pointed through the glass wall to the atrium below, where Malcolm sat beside his son. For the first time, Celeste understood the man she had ordered removed was the signature she had been waiting to celebrate. Celeste replayed the morning in an instant and found no version that made her look careful. She had not merely mistaken Malcolm's title. She had refused to read a policy, overridden a medical warning, blocked a printout, and attempted to redirect a lawful escort through a service corridor. Any one choice might have been explained as stress. Together, they revealed a method. Her first honest option was to acknowledge the harm and open the records. Instead, she searched for a way to separate Malcolm from the process and convert accountability into a private negotiation. Amina had seen executives change their voices around money before. She kept the review formal. She required Celeste's proposed remedies in writing, prohibited discussion of Isaiah's health beyond the access issue, and copied hospital counsel on every message. Those boundaries frustrated Celeste because charm worked best without a transcript. They reassured Malcolm because the Cooperative was behaving the same way it would have behaved for an unknown parent. Process, at its best, made identity less powerful, not more. The recognition did not make her humble. It made her strategic. Celeste hurried downstairs with counsel and cameras kept far behind. She called Malcolm Mr. Reed and said there had been a misunderstanding. Malcolm asked whether Isaiah's appointment had been restored. Celeste said they could make an exception. He answered that an exception for the founder's child would prove the policy was unequal. He wanted the ordinary escalation process followed and the displaced children reviewed. Celeste offered a private suite, a personal physician, and transportation home. Malcolm declined each favor. Isaiah watched Celeste change her tone without changing her explanation. Later, he would tell Malcolm that this was the moment he understood manners and respect were not the same thing. Celeste spoke politely because she needed a signature. She had not yet respected the family's rights. Malcolm asked her to correct the record in front of the same staff and families who had heard her accuse him. She refused, saying public statements created liability. Malcolm said silence had already created something larger, evidence that the institution protected appearances before children. Dr. Lena Ortiz arrived from the cardiac wing with Isaiah's chart in her hand. She had received the portal alert and restored a temporary medication authorization, but the test slot was gone. Celeste told her to open a room immediately. Lena said doing so would push another child out, repeating the same harm. She proposed extending the clinic by 2 hours and seeing both children. Celeste rejected the overtime cost in front of everyone. Malcolm quietly offered MercyLine's existing patient access fund, which had been included in the proposal but never mentioned in Celeste's ceremony speech. Lena became the second person to trust him. She agreed to supervise the extended clinic if administration documented that no family would be billed. The older security officer volunteered his report. Maya submitted the gold code screenshots through the protected portal. None of them acted because Malcolm promised punishment. They acted because he offered a process that cost less than another publicity package and protected more children. By 10:15, the external reviewer had 4 independent records describing the same pattern. Celeste still believed she could contain them before lunch. The other displaced child was 7-year-old Rosa Alvarez, whose mother cleaned offices at night and had already lost 2 shifts attending appointments. Malcolm never met Rosa that morning, but her chart number appeared beside Isaiah's in the reviewer's preserved log. That detail destroyed Celeste's claim that the conflict concerned one demanding vendor. 2 unrelated children had been removed to create empty rooms for a tour. Their medical needs differed, their families had never spoken, and the same executive code linked both decisions. Dr. Ortiz asked Malcolm why he had not identified himself sooner. He told her the honest answer. For several minutes he had been a frightened father, not a founder conducting a test. Only after Celeste denied the printout did he realize his title could distort the evidence. Lena understood. Physicians sometimes saw a room behave differently when a senior doctor entered. The absence of authority could reveal what a checklist concealed. She documented not just the delay, but the medical decisions staff would have made if no executive had intervened. She ordered information technology to disable Maya's access and told security management to revise the incident as a visitor disturbance. The older officer refused to change his account. Celeste suspended him pending review. Then she called the presidents of 3 MercyLine clinics and warned that Malcolm was jeopardizing preferred pricing over a personal grievance. 2 directors became nervous. One suggested signing the deal first and investigating later. Amina reminded them that the certification was a condition of the price, not a public relations detail. Malcolm took Isaiah to the cafeteria while the review continued. The boy picked at toast and asked whether the deal would make them rich. Malcolm explained that MercyLine belonged to its member clinics and that his company earned a fixed management fee. The deal mattered because small clinics could buy medicine together and keep neighborhood care open, if Satan. Catherine lied about access. 38 clinics would be tied to the lie for 5 years. Isaiah turned the repaired orange boat between his fingers and said his mother would have checked every line. Malcolm smiled because he knew the boy was right. 2 weeks earlier, Malcolm had argued against the highest-priced hospital bid. He had recommended St. Catherine because its pediatric access plan appeared efficient and because its proposed rates would save member clinics nearly $2 million over 5 years. He had persuaded skeptical directors by asking them to spend less while demanding measurable care. That principle now cut both ways. Cheap care that vanished when an executive wanted a ceremony was not access. Malcolm sent the board his original analysis with a new note. Price remained strong, but the operational promise required verification. By noon, Celeste launched her counterattack. She told a local business reporter that an unnamed vendor had threatened to cancel an $18 million community partnership unless his child received special treatment. The story appeared online within 20 minutes. MercyLine's phones filled with angry calls. One clinic director resigned from the review panel. A bank officer asked whether the Cooperative's bridge credit was at risk. Celeste's version worked temporarily because it was simple, while the truth sat across multiple records and required patience. The reporter, Nolan Pierce, had received Celeste's calls for years and trusted the access she gave him. He published before requesting the incident report because the ceremony appeared time-sensitive. Within minutes, comments called Malcolm an extortionist and questioned whether MercyLine should control public health money. Nolan then contacted Amina for a response. She gave him no accusation, only the procurement clause, the recusal receipt, and the 4-hour preservation notice. The precision unsettled him. Sensational claims usually arrived with louder language and weaker documents. Malcolm's operations team felt the attack immediately. A supplier paused a shipment until credit was confirmed. Clinic managers asked whether Monday deliveries would arrive. One employee wanted to release security footage obtained from a bystander. Malcolm refused because faces of patients and children were visible. He told the team to solve the shipment first and the headline second. They negotiated a 6-hour extension with the supplier using existing purchase orders, not his reputation. It was a small act of operational truth while the public story remained false. Malcolm read the headline in the pediatric corridor as Isaiah prepared for the extended test. His first instinct was to answer publicly. Amina advised him to wait until the protected reviewer preserved every log. If he released Isaiah's medical details, the story might become a fight over one family instead of the system. Malcolm put his phone away. He had built MercyLine by refusing to confuse speed with strength. Still, the cost of silence felt heavier when another parent recognized him from the article and moved her chair away, Isaiah noticed. He asked whether people online thought Malcolm was a bad father. Malcolm said strangers often chose the first complete story they heard, even when it was false. What mattered was whether they could offer a truer story with proof. Isaiah handed him the orange paper boat and asked him to keep it during the test. It was the third time the boat carried the family through fear, first after his mother's funeral, then during the canceled appointment, and now while a public lie tried to separate father and son. The external reviewer found something worse than displaced appointments. Celeste's office had instructed schedulers to label donor reservations as maintenance so monthly access reports would remain clean. The same labels had been copied into the MercyLine certification. Her attempt to revise the security report created a second integrity issue. Her press statement created a third because it disclosed enough detail to identify Isaiah as a patient without consent. Each choice had been intended to preserve the deal. Together, they made the deal impossible to approve. The gold code pattern stretched back 14 months. Most displaced families had accepted new dates because they did not know an appeal existed. Several medication authorizations had lapsed, producing emergency refill requests that the hospital counted in a different department. On paper, pediatric scheduling remained efficient. In practice, the cost moved into pharmacies, urgent care visits, missed work, and fear. Malcolm had built MercyLine to find exactly that kind of hidden expense. Celeste's clean dashboard was not merely dishonest. It was expensive for everyone outside her executive report. The reviewer reconstructed the chain without relying on any private theory. An assistant created donor holds. A scheduler applied maintenance labels. Celeste's office approved the daily exception list. Finance used the altered access numbers in the partnership forecast. The same forecast supported the expansion loan. By trying to protect a ceremony, Celeste had connected a public humiliation to contract certification and lender risk. Her own insistence on central control made the causal chain easier to prove. Celeste learned that the reviewer had accessed the schedule archive and ordered legal counsel to assert executive privilege. Counsel refused. Operational access data was not legal advice, and the procurement clause required disclosure. Celeste threatened to fire her. The threat was witnessed by the communications director, who had already saved the original ceremony schedule. He realized Celeste would make him responsible for the false statement if the story collapsed. At 1:37, he submitted the schedule and his draft press release to the external portal. The evidence should have settled everything, but MercyLine's board still faced a painful choice. Canceling the partnership would cost member clinics months of work and could raise near-term medicine prices. Signing it would reward false certification. One director proposed a temporary agreement while Celeste remained in charge. Malcolm did not vote because of Isaiah's involvement. Instead, he answered operational questions and offered a third path. Activate MercyLine's existing backup supplier for 90 days, cap the management fee, and reopen bidding with patient access data audited first. His proposal would reduce his own company's revenue. It would also keep medicine moving while the board protected its standards. Amina asked whether his staff could execute the transition by Monday. Malcolm said they could if the clinics accepted fewer custom reports and one shared delivery schedule. The directors saw the difference between leverage and service. Celeste had used a child to protect a photograph. Malcolm was willing to lose money to protect 38 clinics from disruption. The board began to turn, not because he demanded loyalty, but because his plan made their risk smaller. One director challenged Malcolm directly. If standards mattered so much, why had he recommended St. Catherine in the first place? Malcolm did not defend his pride. He said the original recommendation had relied on certified data that now appeared false. Good judgment was not never being wrong. It was changing course when verified facts changed. He invited the board to audit MercyLine's own assumptions and offered to publish the scoring error after patient privacy was protected. The admission cost him authority in the room for a moment, then earned something sturdier than authority: trust. Another director asked whether the Cooperative could demand Celeste's dismissal as a condition of reconsideration. Malcolm said no. MercyLine bought care. It did not appoint hospital leaders. It could require accurate data, protected appeals, and independent audits. St. Catherine's board would decide who could meet those terms. The distinction prevented the story from becoming a powerful man firing a woman who insulted him. The consequence would come from governance, contracts, and the CO's own records. At 2:05, the bank officer restored MercyLine's bridge credit after reviewing the backup plan. The clinic director who had re-signed asked to rejoin but was kept outside the vote to preserve independence. Dr. Ortiz completed Isaiah's test and found no immediate deterioration, though the medication bridge remained necessary. Malcolm thanked her, then asked whether the other displaced child had also been seen. Lena showed him 2 completed charts. No one had received a private favor. The extended clinic had done what policy should have done from the beginning. Celeste made one final attempt to save control. She gathered department chiefs and announced that canceling MercyLine would force layoffs. She blamed Malcolm by name and instructed staff to call board members. The threat frightened people because hospital jobs were real stakes. Yet finance records showed the layoffs had been planned months earlier to fund an executive expansion. The communications director's portal upload included that draft. Celeste had chosen the strongest weapon she knew: fear. And in using it, she exposed the private numbers behind it. At 3:10, St. Catherine's own governing board convened an emergency session. They did not ask whether Malcolm was secretly important. By then, everyone knew. They asked whether the CO's certifications could be trusted. The hospital council presented the access codes, the attempted report revision, the press disclosure, and the false layoff claim. The older security officer joined by video from his suspension and read his unchanged dispatch notes. Maya described the hidden gold code. Dr. Ortiz explained the medical risk. Their accounts aligned without rehearsal. Celeste attacked each witness separately. Maya was disgruntled, the officer insubordinate, Lena naive about budgets, counsel overly cautious, and Malcolm personally motivated. The board chair noticed the pattern. Every person who produced a record became the problem, while no record received an answer. He asked Celeste a narrow question. Had she authorized donor holds to be labeled as maintenance? She said the terminology came from operations. Operations produced her signed directive. The room went silent, not because Malcolm had arrived with secret power, but because Celeste had run out of people to blame. Nolan Pierce watched the public portion of the meeting online and corrected his article before anyone demanded it. He added the recusal receipt, the preserved incident number, and the hospital's own audit notice. The correction traveled more slowly than the accusation, but it traveled with documents. Malcolm did not thank him publicly or attack the first story. He sent one message: "Please remove every detail that could identify the children." Nolan complied and later wrote a separate piece about how executive access can disguise scheduling choices as technical failures. Malcolm did not enter the boardroom. He sat with Isaiah near the atrium window and watched the rain lighten over the parking garage. A reporter waited outside, but Malcolm declined an interview until the procurement vote was final. Isaiah asked what would happen to Celeste. Malcolm said consequences were the board's responsibility, not theirs. Their responsibility was deciding what MercyLine would buy and what it would refuse to excuse. Isaiah repaired another crease in the paper boat and said refusing could be a kind of building. At 4:22, MercyLine's directors voted to reject Syntec, Catherine's 5-year proposal for material misrepresentation and to activate the 90-day backup plan. The vote was not unanimous, but it was documented and independent. Amina signed the notice. The $18 million deal did not explode in a dramatic phone call. It ended through the exact process Celeste had tried to manipulate. 38 clinics received transition instructions before the press received a statement. Medicine moved first. Reputation came second. St. Catherine's board saw the rejection arrive while Celeste was still arguing that the situation could be managed. The lost partnership triggered a lender review because projected MercyLine revenue had supported the hospital's expansion budget. No one went to jail. The building did not change ownership in an hour. Instead, the hospital faced the believable consequence of its own records: an executive leave, an independent access audit, and a delayed construction plan. At 4:41, the board placed Celeste on administrative suspension and restored the security officer. Celeste returned to the atrium without cameras. The same registration desk stood beneath the same sign, but the crowd had changed. Staff now knew Malcolm's name. She stopped before him and said he could have avoided everything by identifying himself. Malcolm looked toward Isaiah, then back at her. He spoke only one sentence. A child should not need his father to own the contract before you follow the rule. He took Isaiah's hand and walked toward the pharmacy without waiting for an answer. At exactly 5 p.m., the ceremony banner was removed. Maya watched maintenance lower it while the hospital's public screen posted a notice about the independent access review. She did not celebrate Celeste's suspension. She returned to registration and helped a grandmother appeal a canceled neurology visit using the same protected channel she had once feared. The older security officer resumed his shift and asked dispatch to preserve calls involving patient disputes automatically. Small procedures began changing before any speech could claim victory. MercyLine's backup plan cost less than expected. Malcolm eliminated the ceremonial travel budget and redirected the savings to shared deliveries and 2 independent patient advocates. Over the next month, 3 hospitals submitted new bids with access data attached. St. Catherine was allowed to rebid only after the audit because accountability was not exile. Malcolm insisted that no institution be permanently defined by one leader if its people were willing to repair the system. Maya joined the audit team as a protected staff representative. The hospital board offered Malcolm a seat on its reform committee. He declined the voting position because MercyLine might bid with the hospital again. Instead, he nominated a rotating panel of parents from neighborhood clinics and asked that their travel and childcare be paid. Influence, he believed, should be designed so it survived the person who first possessed it. The board accepted. The first panel meeting included Rosa's mother, who arrived after a night shift and asked why maintenance codes could ever override a child's medication deadline. No executive had a comfortable answer. Celeste's suspension became permanent after the audit, but Malcolm never used her name in MercyLine training. He turned the failure into a case study about incentives, ceremony metrics, hidden cues, retaliation, and the danger of private exceptions. Staff practiced responding to a powerless parent because powerful parents rarely needed the practice. Malcolm insisted every scenario end with a documented next step. Empathy without procedure could disappear when the kind employee went home. 6 months later, the extended pediatric clinic had become a permanent evening program funded jointly by MercyLine and participating hospitals. The first family helped under the new policy was a single mother whose son's medication authorization would have expired over a holiday weekend. She never met Malcolm. She did not need to know his title. A patient advocate saw the warning, opened a same-day review, and protected the appointment without asking whether the family had influence. That quiet success was the legacy Malcolm wanted. Catherine's public access dashboard changed as well. Instead of one polished monthly percentage, it showed postponements by cause, appeal outcomes, medication risks, and the time required to restore care. The numbers initially looked worse because hidden failures had become visible. Malcolm defended the hospital when critics treated transparency as new incompetence. Honest measurement was the beginning of repair, he said, not proof that repair had failed. Within 4 months, avoidable pediatric postponements fell by more than half, and emergency refill requests began dropping. The older security officer helped rewrite the response protocol for patient disputes. Officers would first ask whether a medical escalation was active, preserve dispatch audio, and involve a patient advocate before considering removal. The policy did not prevent security from addressing real danger. It prevented an executive's embarrassment from being mislabeled as danger. Maya placed a laminated copy beneath the registration desk. Each time she saw it, she remembered how close she had come to staying silent, and how one preserved incident number had protected everyone who finally spoke. Malcolm also changed MercyLine. Every future hospital review included an unannounced test of the ordinary appeal path, performed by an independent auditor with no visible title. Member clinics voted to publish founder recusals and backup plans before major contracts were signed. Those rules limited Malcolm too, which was precisely why he trusted them. Isaiah once asked whether all the new paperwork made work harder. Malcolm said yes, then explained that a good rule should make it harder for power to hide and easier for a child to receive the care already promised. Isaiah kept the original orange paper boat on a shelf above his desk. For a school project, he built a cardboard hospital entrance with 2 doors labeled donors and everyone. Then he crossed out the first label and made both doors the same width. Malcolm asked what the model was supposed to teach. Isaiah said institutions were just rules that people practiced until the rules felt like walls. If the wall is wrong, he added, you do not have to become mean. You make a better door. Have you ever watched someone be treated like they did not belong and wished you had spoken sooner? Tell us what you would have done. Comment Still Waters so we know where you are watching from. Share this story with someone who believes dignity should never depend on status. And subscribe for more stories about the fathers the world walks past. Because still waters run deep, and the quiet person beside you may be carrying the truth an entire institution refused to see.